She grabbed the small beige device off the side of my 7-year-old son's head, held it up in front of the entire first-class cabin like she'd caught him cheating on a test, and said, loud enough for every row around us to hear, "Maybe if it's off, he'll finally stop making that noise." My son's hand shot up to the bare spot behind his ear where his cochlear implant used to be, and his mouth opened in a silent, panicked shape that broke something in my chest I didn't know could still break. He couldn't scream. He couldn't cry out. He is mute, and in that moment, 32,000 feet over Kansas, he had no way in the entire world to ask for help except to look at me with an expression I will never forget for the rest of my life. For a second, I didn't move. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about a mother who reacted instantly and heroically. This is a story about a woman who sat frozen for one full breath, staring at the small device dangling from a stranger's fingers, before every ounce of training I had ever received in my life caught up with my body and told me exactly what to do next. I have negotiated with people who held far more power than the woman sitting in seat 2C, and in that one frozen second, none of it mattered at all. All that mattered was my son's face. But I need to take you back to how this all started, because none of what happens next will make sense without it. 6 hours earlier, we were just a mother and her son trying to get from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles for a surgery consultation that could change the rest of his life. Nobody on that plane knew my name. Nobody knew what I actually did for a living, or who I had spent the last 4 years representing at the highest levels of the United States government, or the kinds of rooms I walked into on an ordinary Tuesday morning. To every single person on that Boeing 787, I was just Sarah in seat 2A, traveling with a quiet little boy in seat 2B. That was exactly how I wanted it. I have spent my entire career learning how to sit in a room and let people underestimate me completely, and on that flight, for reasons that would become devastatingly clear before we ever touched down in California, that particular skill was about to matter more than it ever had in my life. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, not the flight attendants, not the passengers, not even the captain flying that plane, was exactly who she had just made the single biggest mistake of her entire life against. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and before I tell you what happened next, I have to tell you who I actually am, because none of this makes sense without it. I live in a brick colonial on a quiet street in Alexandria, Virginia, with a crooked mailbox my husband keeps meaning to fix and a golden retriever named Biscuit who sheds on every single piece of furniture we own, no matter how many times we vacuum. On an ordinary Saturday, you'd find me at Eli's speech and language therapy appointment at 9 in the morning, the farmer's market down on King Street by 11, and elbow deep in a lasagna by 6 that evening, usually burning the garlic bread a little because I get distracted answering emails. I drive a Honda Odyssey with a cracked cup holder and a permanent smell of goldfish crackers ground into the back seat. I forget to defrost chicken more often than I would like to admit to anyone at a dinner party. I am, in every visible way that matters to a stranger sitting beside me on an airplane, an unremarkable American mother. What most people never learn about me, at least not right away, is that I currently serve as the United States Secretary of State. I don't say that to impress anyone, and if you've watched enough of these stories, you already know it isn't really the point. I say it because in my line of work, I had learned to stay calm in situations most people could never imagine, situations that make an argument over a cup of apple juice look almost quaint by comparison. I have sat across long conference tables from foreign ministers who were, quite literally, trying to figure out how to start a war before lunch. I have been in rooms where the wrong word in the wrong tone could unravel a decade of careful diplomatic work built by people who came before me. I have negotiated the release of American citizens held hostage overseas while keeping my voice as steady and unremarkable as if I were simply ordering coffee at a drive-through window. I had faced far more dangerous situations than a disagreement in a first-class airplane cabin, and that steadiness, that terrible, deeply practiced calm, was the only reason I didn't come apart completely when I watched a total stranger rip a piece of my son's hearing directly off the side of his head. I got this job the hard way, the slow way, the way most people never see on the news. I was a scholarship kid from a small town in Ohio most people couldn't find on a map if you gave them 30 seconds and a flashlight, the first person in my family to finish college, and I spent nearly 20 years grinding through the ranks of the State Department before anyone in Washington ever bothered to learn my name. I have a small scar on my left eyebrow from a car accident in college that I'm secretly a little vain about hiding under my bangs during television appearances. I am, despite what my job might suggest to a stranger, absolutely terrified of public speaking without a written speech directly in front of me, which is a strange thing to admit for someone who negotiates with foreign heads of state on a regular basis, but it is completely true. I am not a superhero, and I want to be clear about that from the very beginning. I am a mother who happens to have a very unusual job, and on that Tuesday morning, my job was the furthest thing from my mind. My son was everything. My husband, David, is a middle school science teacher, and he is the one who taught both of us most of our sign language vocabulary long before any professional therapist ever did. Sitting cross-legged on our living room floor with a battered picture dictionary he'd ordered online during Eli's first year of diagnosis. He is steadier than I am in almost every way that matters, the kind of person who remembers to renew the car registration and always knows exactly where the spare key is hidden. He couldn't join us on that trip to Los Angeles because of a parent-teacher conference he refused to cancel, and he called me twice that morning before we boarded just to make sure Eli had his favorite dinosaur book packed in his backpack, a small, ordinary act of love that I thought about constantly during everything that happened next. I think it matters that you understand I did not board that flight thinking of myself as any kind of protector or authority figure. I boarded it thinking about gate change announcements, about whether Eli's ears would pop uncomfortably during descent, about the specific granola bar he likes that they never seem to stock at the airport kiosk near our gate. The title in my jacket pocket was, for those first 90 minutes, nothing more than paperwork I carry out of habit and requirement, not a weapon I was waiting to use against anyone. It became something else entirely only because someone else decided to make it necessary. Eli Mitchell is 7 years old, and he is, without a single ounce of exaggeration, the best person I have ever met in my entire life. He has my husband's dark curly hair and my late mother's pale gray eyes, and when he smiles, which is often, his whole face lights up like someone flipped a switch behind it that nobody else can see. Eli is fiercely, wonderfully stubborn, the kind of stubborn that used to worry me constantly until his therapist gently told me it would serve him well later in life, and she was right, because I have watched that same stubbornness carry him through more hard days than any 7-year-old should have to face. He is endlessly patient with his little sister Maya, even when she steals his crayons and colors outside every single line on purpose just to make him laugh. And he notices everything, absolutely everything, the way a stranger's shoe is untied, the way a cloud looks exactly like a rabbit if you tilt your head, the specific way I get quiet when I'm worried even when I'm trying very hard to hide it from him. Eli was born profoundly deaf, and he is also completely nonverbal, which means that even with his cochlear implant giving him meaningful access to sound for the very first time in his life, he has never once spoken a single word out loud. He communicates through American Sign Language, through a tablet loaded with picture icons and a text-to-speech function he is slowly learning to use, through the single most expressive eyebrows I have ever seen on a human being, and through a cochlear implant that took 3 separate surgeries, 2 full years of intensive auditory therapy, and more insurance phone calls than I could ever count to finally get exactly right. That small beige device curled behind his ear isn't a hearing aid you can simply take off and slip back on like a pair of sunglasses at the beach. It's connected through a magnet implanted surgically under his skin, wired directly to a piece of technology fused permanently to the bone of his skull, and it is, in the most literal and clinical sense possible, his only bridge to the sound of his own mother's voice. That morning, before any of this happened, Eli had spent 20 minutes at the gate signing to me about the airplane window seat, his hands moving in fast, delighted little bursts, asking me over and over if we might see clouds shaped like dinosaurs from up so high in the sky. He does this thing when he's truly, purely happy where he presses his palms together and shakes them rapidly, like he's applauding the entire world just for existing around him. And he did that exact thing when a flight attendant handed him a set of little plastic wings and called him Captain with a warm, easy smile. I have a photo on my phone from 30 seconds before it all fell apart completely, Eli grinning with those plastic wings pinned crookedly to his shirt. His eyes crinkled up with pure, uncomplicated joy, completely unaware that in exactly 30 seconds, a stranger 3 rows up was about to notice him for the very first time. What was she waiting for during those 30 seconds? What kind of person watches a 7-year-old boy laughing silently at the shape of the clouds and decides, right then and there, that he is the problem? Boarding that morning had been ordinary in every way a morning can be ordinary before it becomes something you tell strangers about for years afterward. Eli had insisted on pulling his own small rolling suitcase, the one covered in dinosaur stickers he had chosen himself at the airport gift shop the last time we flew, and Marcus had crouched down to admire it personally, asking Eli in an easy, unhurried voice which dinosaur was his favorite, and Eli had signed back Triceratops, patting his own head twice for the 3 horns, a gesture that made Marcus laugh out loud and made my own chest loosen just slightly after a stressful morning of packing. I remember thinking, as we settled into our seats, that it was going to be a good flight, an easy flight, the kind of unremarkable travel day that fades from memory within a week. She was already seated in 2C when we boarded, and I noticed her the way you notice weather turning before a rail storm arrives. Nothing dramatic yet, just a subtle shift in the pressure of the air around you. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in a cream silk blouse and a blazer the color of a robin's egg. Her hair blown out to a stiffness that suggested she'd had it professionally done that very morning specifically for this flight. She had the posture of someone used to being obeyed without question, shoulders pulled back, chin slightly lifted, the kind of woman who doesn't sit down in a seat so much as she occupies it entirely, spreading her belongings across the shared armrest before the boarding door had even fully closed behind the last passenger. Her first words to a flight attendant, before we'd even pushed back from the gate at Dulles, were, "I specifically requested no children in this cabin when I booked. I paid a great deal of money for first class for a reason." The flight attendant, a young man with a kind, tired face and a name tag that read Marcus, had explained gently that first-class seating wasn't ever guaranteed to be child-free on a commercial airline, and she had made a small, sharp noise through her nose, the kind of sound that says clearly, without a single word, "I will remember this and someone will pay for it." I found out later, from another passenger who recognized her from a previous flight, that she had done something almost identical the year before on a route to Miami, gotten an entire family removed from first class over nothing more than a crying toddler, and had actually bragged about the whole incident to a coworker while waiting at baggage claim. This was not her first storm. She had done this exact thing before, and she expected, as she apparently always had, to get away with it again without a single consequence. That same passenger, a woman traveling for a work conference who recognized her from the Miami flight, later told a local reporter that she remembered the exact phrase Karen had used back then too, almost word for word, as if she kept a small, practiced script of complaints ready in her back pocket for any child who dared to exist near her on an airplane. It was like watching someone read from a script they'd used 100 times before, the woman said. She wasn't even angry, not really. She was just performing being angry, the way some people perform being important. That detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else I learned afterward, because it meant this had never really been about noise or juice or a battery alert at all. It had always, from the very beginning, only ever been about power, and about who she believed was allowed to have any of it in a shared public space. She noticed Eli for the first time when he made his small, happy sound. Not a word, just a soft, tuneless hum of pure contentment that some deaf and hard-of-hearing children make without ever fully realizing they're making it out loud. She turned around fully in her seat, looked at him for 3 long, deliberate seconds, and I watched something in her face settle into place, the exact way a hunter's face settles once they've finally spotted movement in the brush. She had found her target for the flight, and some deeply unwell part of her seemed almost relieved to have found it. "Can you keep him quiet?" she said, directly to me, not even bothering with a greeting first or a moment of introduction. "Some of us are trying to relax after a very long week." I told her, as calmly as I possibly could manage, that he wasn't being loud at all, that he was a good boy, that we had a long flight ahead of us and I would absolutely do my best to keep things peaceful for everyone around us. She looked at me the way you'd look at a waiter who had just brought you the wrong order entirely, unimpressed, unmoved, already deciding I wasn't worth the effort of a real conversation between 2 adults. And there, for just a moment, something flickered across her face that looked almost like exhaustion, almost like a private grief she was carrying that had nothing to do with any of us. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I want to be fair to her, even now, even knowing absolutely everything that happened after that moment. In that brief flicker before she spoke again, I thought I saw a woman who had maybe had a genuinely terrible year, who was maybe carrying something heavy underneath all that silk and confidence that I couldn't possibly see from the outside. It made me soften toward her, just slightly, for exactly 4 seconds. And then she opened her mouth again, and every single trace of that softness evaporated completely, replaced by something much colder. "I don't care what kind of good boy he supposedly is," she said. "I care that I'm not going to spend 5 hours listening to whatever that sound was." I told her, still calm, still measured, still using the exact voice I use with diplomats who have said something offensive out of ignorance rather than outright malice, that he was actually deaf, that the sound he made wasn't always something he could fully control, and that I sincerely appreciated her patience with our family. I said it kindly. I gave her the exit ramp, the graceful way out of a conversation that hadn't needed to happen at all. She didn't take it. She never even glanced at it. "That's not my problem," she said. Loud enough now for the row directly behind us to hear every single word clearly. "Maybe he shouldn't even be flying if he can't be controlled properly." Marcus, the flight attendant, leaned in and said quietly that everything was completely fine, that the family wasn't doing anything wrong at all, and asked her gently if she'd like a complimentary drink to help her settle in for the flight. She waved him off like he was nothing more than an insect buzzing near her face. "I don't want a drink," she said. "I want the peace and quiet that I actually paid for." She said this while a family across the aisle exchanged a quick glance, the universal, silent language of strangers agreeing without a single word that someone has just crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. A businessman 2 rows up shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A grandmother near the window pursed her lips and shook her head slowly, the specific disapproval of a woman who had raised 4 children and had absolutely no patience left for cruelty towards someone else's. I felt something tighten low in my chest, the specific, private fury of a parent whose child has just been called a problem by an adult who should absolutely know better at her age. But I have spent 2 decades training myself not to let my face show what my body is actually feeling underneath it, and so I turned back to Eli, signed to him that everything was okay, that mommy loved him more than anything, and watched him nod, trusting me completely, the way children trust their parents right up until the exact moment the world proves them wrong. We settled in for takeoff, and for almost 45 minutes, things stayed relatively quiet. Eli colored carefully in his dinosaur book, staying mostly inside the lines the way he liked to. I answered emails on my laptop, the kind of emails that would have made her expensive blazer catch fire on the spot if she'd had any idea what they actually said or who they were addressed to. And then his cochlear implant processor let out a small, soft chirp, meaning the battery needed changing, a completely routine sound that happens multiple times throughout an ordinary day, and I reached into his backpack for a spare battery the way I have done 1,000 times before without a second thought. "Oh my God," she said, twisting around in her seat again with visible, theatrical irritation. "Is that thing going to keep beeping the entire flight? I cannot deal with this." I explained patiently that it was simply a battery alert, that it would take about 10 seconds to fix completely, and that I was sorry for the small interruption to her afternoon. She rolled her eyes so hard I actually heard the motion land somewhere in her voice a second later. "This is exactly why I don't fly first class as often anymore," she announced to no one in particular and yet somehow to everyone at once. "It used to actually mean something back when I started flying regularly." A woman 2 rows back, a grandmother with a soft Georgia drawl and a cardigan the color of butter, murmured just loud enough for me to hear clearly, "Bless her heart, she has got some nerve today." And I felt a small, grateful warmth spread through my chest toward a complete stranger I had never met before that morning. I want you to understand something before I go any further into this story. I have negotiated ceasefires between nations that had been at war for generations. I have sat in rooms with men who held the power to end lives with a single phone call to the right person, and I have kept my composure through every single one of those moments without flinching. But nothing, absolutely nothing in 20 years of rigorous diplomatic training, prepared me for how hard it is to stay calm when someone insults your own child in front of 40 strangers. Every single time she spoke, I felt the professional version of myself and the mother version of myself fighting hard for control of my own mouth, and every single time, for Eli's sake alone, the professional won that fight. I kept my voice level and even. I kept offering her every reasonable off-ramp a person could possibly offer another human being. I told myself, the way I always do in tense international negotiations, that de-escalation wins far more often than aggression ever does, even when it costs me something privately. She didn't want de-escalation, though. She wanted an audience, and she was determined to get one no matter what it cost anyone else around her. An hour into the flight, the beverage service finally came through the cabin, and Eli, delighted, signed to me that he wanted the apple juice, doing his little hand flourish that always makes me laugh out loud even on the hardest days we have together. Marcus poured it carefully into a small plastic cup and handed it to Eli with a warm smile, and Eli, absolutely thrilled, held it up toward the window like he was toasting the clouds passing by outside. It was, I later learned from another passenger, exactly the kind of picture-perfect image of innocence that made what happened next so much harder for everyone around us to watch unfold. She reached over without any warning at all. Her hand closed around the cup, and then she pulled it from his hand entirely, the juice sloshing over the rim and directly onto his lap, cold and sudden, and Eli's face crumpled into the silent, wide-mouthed shape of a cry with absolutely no sound behind it at all. His hands flying up instinctively toward his ears, the universal gesture of a child who is completely overwhelmed and afraid of what just happened to him. "You people need to control this," she snapped, setting the cup down hard on her own tray table like she had just heroically rescued it from some kind of disaster. "I don't want juice spilled on me from a kid who can't even say sorry for it." The cabin went still in that specific electric way a room goes still right before everyone remembers they're actually allowed to react to what they just witnessed. A businessman across the aisle actually stood halfway up out of his seat before sitting back down slowly, his jaw tight with visible restraint. A woman near the galley started quietly recording on her phone, her thumb steady, her face grim and focused. Somewhere behind me, a voice with a flat, direct New York cadence said, "Are you kidding me right now, lady? He's a little boy who can't even hear you." And another voice, softer, Midwestern, almost apologetic in its own quiet firmness, added, "Ma'am, I really don't think that was necessary at all." Marcus came back immediately, kneeling slightly to speak to her at eye level. His voice professional but noticeably tighter now, a thread of real alarm running underneath the calm surface of his words. "Ma'am, I need to ask you not to touch other passengers or their personal belongings," he said clearly. She waved her hand at him again, dismissive, imperious, utterly unmoved by his obvious concern. "He shouldn't have had it in the first place if he was going to be careless with it," she said, as if a 7-year-old spilling 2 ounces of apple juice was somehow a criminal offense requiring immediate federal intervention on her behalf. Eli was shaking now, his small hands still pressed hard against his ears, tears streaking silently down both cheeks, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very cold, the specific stillness I have felt exactly twice before in my entire career, once during a hostage negotiation overseas, and once during a classified briefing where I learned information that would keep me awake for nearly a year afterward. It's the particular stillness that comes right before I stop reacting entirely and start deciding what comes next with complete clarity. I leaned down and gently pulled Eli's hands away from his ears so I could sign to him, slow and clear, the way I have practiced with him 1,000 times before during hard moments. "You are safe," I signed. "You did nothing wrong. I love you so much." I watched him read my hands carefully, watched some of the panic drain slowly out of his small shoulders, and in that moment I made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of that flight, though nobody sitting around me had any idea of it yet. She believed, in that exact moment, that she had already won completely. She sat back in her seat, satisfied, arms crossed tightly over her chest, chin lifted in the exact posture of a woman who has always believed consequences are things that happen to other, lesser people. She had absolutely no idea that 4 rows behind her, a grandmother from Georgia was already quietly asking a second flight attendant for the name and extension of the airline's customer relations department. She had no idea that the man across the aisle had already screenshotted the video recording being taken near the galley entrance. She had no idea that Marcus, when he walked back toward the front of the cabin a moment later, stopped for exactly 2 seconds at the closed curtain leading toward the cockpit and spoke quietly to someone standing just inside it. She had absolutely no idea who I was, and I intended for just a little while longer to keep it exactly that way. There is a particular kind of quiet I have only ever felt in 2 other places in my life, once in a windowless room overseas where I was told, in careful diplomatic language, that a plan we had spent 18 months building had just collapsed in a single afternoon, and once standing outside a hospital room the night my mother passed away, the hallway fluorescent lights humming overhead like they didn't understand what had just happened inside that room. That is the quiet I felt settle over me in seat 2A, somewhere over the middle of Kansas, watching my son's tears fall silently into his lap. It is not the quiet of someone who has nothing left to say. It is the quiet of someone who has finally stopped wasting words on a person who was never going to listen to them in the first place. For the next several minutes, I said nothing at all, and I want you to understand what silence like that actually feels like from the inside, because it isn't emptiness in any sense of the word. It is, in fact, the loudest, fullest silence a person can possibly hold inside their own chest. I signed quietly with Eli, wiped the juice carefully from his lap with a napkin, checked gently that his implant hadn't been damaged in the commotion, and did not look at her once, not out of fear of her, but because I no longer needed to look at her at all to know exactly what was about to happen to her life. I had already reached quietly into my bag and texted my chief of staff one short, clipped sentence. Incident on flight, will need airline liaison and appropriate personnel at LAX gate on arrival. I set my phone face down carefully on the tray table and folded my hands in my lap, waiting the way I have learned to wait through some of the tensest hours of my entire career. The change in the cabin happened slowly at first, and then all at once, the way real change in a room almost always does. Marcus, who had been kneeling by her seat earlier, now stood at the front of the aisle speaking in a low voice to a second attendant, both of them glancing back toward row 2 with a stiffness in their posture that hadn't been there even an hour earlier during boarding. A third crew member, older, clearly senior in rank, emerged from the galley and walked the full length of the cabin without stopping to serve a single drink to anyone, her eyes moving briefly, deliberately, toward my seat before continuing forward toward the cockpit. Passengers who had been only half paying attention up to that point now sat up straighter in their seats, sensing, the way people always seem to instinctively sense, that something important was shifting in the air of the cabin even before they fully understood exactly what it was. The grandmother from Georgia caught my eye briefly and gave the smallest, most knowing nod, as if she already understood something the rest of the cabin hadn't quite pieced together yet. She mistook every single bit of it for her own personal victory. Finally, she said loudly, to the row in general, her voice carrying that specific satisfaction of someone who believes she has never once faced a real consequence in her entire life. Some actual peace and quiet on this flight. She smoothed the front of her expensive blazer, sipped from a fresh drink Marcus had brought her without a word of comment, and said, with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from a lifetime of assuming other people will simply absorb the cost of your behavior, I don't know why people bring children they clearly can't control onto an airplane like this is supposed to be some kind of daycare service. A few seats back, the New York voice muttered something sharp under his breath that I couldn't quite catch, and she either didn't hear it at all or simply didn't care enough to respond, because she kept right on going, undeterred. Some of us actually worked very hard for these seats, she announced to the cabin at large. I don't owe anyone an apology for wanting exactly what I paid good money for. I let her finish completely. I let her have that entire moment in full, because I understood something in that instant that she did not yet understand at all, something I had learned the hard way over 2 decades of watching powerful people underestimate quiet rooms. The quietest room is always, without fail, the one sitting right before the walls come down completely. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I placed it on the tray table between us. She looked down at it, and for the first time since she had boarded this flight, she went completely, utterly silent. It was a small leather folio, navy blue, worn soft at the edges from years of use, and inside it sat a federal identification card with the Great Seal of the United States embossed above my photograph and my name printed in clean, unmistakable letters beneath the title Secretary of State. I did not raise my voice even slightly. I did not lean toward her. I simply let it sit there on the tray table between us, catching the cabin light in a way that made the gold seal gleam, while Marcus, hovering nearby, went completely still himself. Her eyes moved from the card to my face and back to the card again, and I watched confusion arrive first, the flicker of a woman trying desperately to make sense of letters that didn't fit the small, dismissive story she'd already written about me in her head. Then disbelief followed, her mouth opening slightly as though she were about to laugh the whole thing off as some kind of elaborate prank being played on her. Then recognition, slow and terrible, as she finally connected the title printed on that card to a face she had, at some point over the last 4 years, seen on a television screen delivering careful remarks about foreign policy from a podium in front of an American flag. And then, finally, panic arrived, her hand actually rising slightly off the shared armrest as if she meant to reach out and take the card back from the table, before stopping herself completely and folding both hands tightly in her lap like a child who has just been caught somewhere she was never supposed to be. I had no way of knowing, she started, her voice suddenly small in a way it hadn't been for the entire flight, and I finally spoke, my own voice even and quiet enough that the entire forward section of the cabin leaned in slightly just to hear it clearly. You didn't need to know who I was, I said. To know that a child doesn't deserve to have his hearing device ripped off the side of his head in front of 40 strangers. That should never have required my job title to matter to you at all. She opened her mouth again, and absolutely nothing came out of it this time. Within 90 seconds, the senior flight attendant was crouched beside my seat, speaking in a low, urgent voice, confirming quietly that she had already radioed ahead to ground operations at LAX, that the incident had been logged in real time by the crew, and that local law enforcement along with a representative from the airline's corporate security office would be waiting directly at the gate the moment we landed. I had not asked for any of it specifically. I did not need to. This is simply what happens quietly and efficiently when the machinery of consequence finally turns toward the person who assumed, right up until that moment, that she would never have to face it at all. The captain's voice came over the intercom a few minutes later, calm and measured, clearly chosen with extreme care for its steadiness. Folks, we're going to be landing shortly, and I want to sincerely thank everyone on board today for their patience, he said. We do ask that all passengers remain seated until law enforcement personnel have completed a brief matter near the front of the cabin before general deplaning begins. His voice was even and professional, but there was no mistaking the specific weight underneath every single word. The sound of a man who had been fully briefed on exactly what had happened and was choosing his language with extreme deliberate care. She tried, in the final 20 minutes of that flight, absolutely everything a person in her exact position tries when the ground finally shifts beneath them. She tried apologizing directly to me first, her voice suddenly soft, suddenly reasonable, as if reasonableness were simply a costume she could slip on now that the stakes had visibly changed in her favor. I did not respond to her at all. She tried explaining, unprompted, that she'd had a genuinely difficult week, that her flight the previous month had been delayed twice already, that she wasn't usually like this at all, as if a difficult week were somehow an acceptable trade for a 7-year-old's tears in front of an entire cabin. She tried, at one point, actually reaching toward Eli with a strained, performative smile pasted across her face, saying, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean anything by it. Really?" And I watched my son, 7 years old and still trembling slightly, shrink away from her without needing a single spoken word to communicate exactly how he felt about her sudden kindness. She tried invoking names next, mentioning a cousin who supposedly worked in local government, a friend who knew people in the airline industry, as if proximity to minor power might somehow undo what she had done in full view of 40 witnesses and at least 3 separate phone cameras. Every single attempt failed completely, because there was no version of the story left where the truth wasn't already sitting safely in a dozen other people's pockets, recorded, time-stamped, and fully ready to be shared the moment we landed. When the plane finally taxied to the gate at LAX, 2 uniformed officers boarded first, along with a woman in a dark tailored suit who introduced herself quietly to me as the airline's corporate security liaison for the West Coast region. Marcus walked her through the incident report he had already prepared from crew notes taken in real time throughout the flight, his voice steady and clear as he recounted each moment. The senior flight attendant added her own account, confirming every detail Marcus had already given. Passengers around us, the grandmother from Georgia, the direct-voiced man from New York, the quiet Midwestern woman by the window who had barely spoken until now, all offered statements without being asked twice, several of them saying some version of the exact same sentence. That boy did absolutely nothing wrong, and she should be deeply ashamed of herself. She was escorted off the plane in front of every single passenger seated in that cabin, her face rigid, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, no longer meeting anyone's gaze at all. Nobody applauded loudly, because it truly wasn't that kind of moment, not a movie moment, just a quiet, human one. But I heard it clearly, quiet and unmistakable, a low ripple of exhales and murmured relief moving slowly down the length of the aisle, the specific sound of a room that has just watched a genuine wrong finally get set right in front of them. The businessman across the aisle caught my eye as she passed and gave a small, respectful nod. The grandmother reached over and gently squeezed Eli's shoulder, and he, brave and resilient in the particular way only children can somehow manage to be, gave her a small, wobbly smile in return that nearly broke my heart all over again. Before she was ever let off that aircraft, though, there were still several minutes left in that cabin, and I want to tell you about them because this is the part people always ask me about later, the part they say felt like watching a courtroom deliver a verdict 30,000 feet in the air with no judge and no jury box, just 40 strangers who had all quietly agreed on the truth. The officers who boarded first asked her to remain seated while they reviewed the incident report Marcus had already prepared. She tried one more time to explain herself, her voice pitched now toward the officers instead of toward me, as if a change of audience might somehow change the outcome. "This is completely unnecessary," she said. "It was a misunderstanding between adults, nothing more than that." One of the officers, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and an unreadable expression, simply said, "Ma'am, we have 3 separate video recordings and 11 witness statements. This isn't a misunderstanding." And something in her voice, flat and final, seemed to land harder on her than anything I had said to her all flight. The corporate security liaison, still standing near my row, asked quietly whether I intended to press for any formal charges, and I told her the truth, that my priority had never been punishment for its own sake, only making sure nothing like this ever happened to another family on one of their aircraft again. She nodded slowly, made a note, and said something I have thought about often since. "Most people in your position would want her to suffer," she said. "You just want a system that works." I told her that was exactly right, and that the two things weren't always the same, even if they sometimes looked similar from the outside. The businessman across the aisle, the one who had half stood earlier during the incident with the apple juice, leaned over before deplaning and introduced himself simply as Walter, a retired Army officer from Texas flying home to see his grandchildren. "I've seen a lot of people fold under pressure in my life," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Never seen anybody stay that steady while somebody was hurting their kid. That took more discipline than most folks have in a lifetime." I thanked him and meant it more than he probably realized, because there had been at least a dozen moments on that flight where staying steady had felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. The Georgia grandmother, whose name I learned was Doris, gathered her cardigan and her carry-on and paused beside our row on her way out. "Honey, I raised 5 children and buried a husband," she said, patting my hand gently. "I have seen ugly behavior in my time, but watching that woman go after a little deaf boy, that is a special kind of ugly. You handled it like a lady the whole time, and don't you let anybody tell you different." Eli, watching her hands move as she spoke, tugged gently at my sleeve and signed a simple thank you toward her, and Doris, though she didn't know sign language, pressed her palm to her heart in a gesture he understood perfectly without a single word passing between them. The quiet Midwestern woman from the window seat, who introduced herself only as Carol, stopped last of all, hesitating slightly before she spoke, the way people do when they aren't used to inserting themselves into other people's business. "I just want you to know I filed a statement," she said softly. "I don't usually get involved in things like this, but what she did wasn't right, and I couldn't just sit there and say nothing." I told her that her willingness to speak up mattered enormously, more than she probably knew, because it is always so much easier for good people to stay quiet than to speak, and the fact that she hadn't stayed quiet meant everything to me and to Eli both. Once we were inside the terminal, away from the crowd still filing off the aircraft, the airline liaison walked us to a quiet lounge area near the gate and asked gently if there was anything at all they could do for Eli or for me in the immediate aftermath. I asked only that they check the recording equipment on his cochlear implant processor to make sure nothing internal had been damaged during the incident, a request they arranged within minutes through a technician on standby. Eli sat quietly beside me the entire time. Over the following weeks, the consequences arrived one at a time, each one delivered with the specific, unhurried certainty of a system finally doing exactly what it was designed to do all along. The airline permanently banned her from all future flights on their carrier, citing multiple prior incidents already sitting in her customer file that had never previously resulted in any real action being taken against her. Her employer, a mid-sized consulting firm based out of Ohio, placed her on administrative leave within 48 hours after footage taken by 3 separate passengers was picked up first by local news and then quickly by several national outlets. The Transportation Security Administration opened a formal review after determining that her conduct constituted interference with a minor passenger requiring medical accommodation. A review that would follow her for months afterward and complicate her ability to travel domestically at all. And perhaps worst of all, for a woman who had clearly valued her reputation more than almost anything else in her life, her own adult daughter, reached by a reporter for comment on the story, said simply, "I'm embarrassed. That's not how we raised her to treat anyone, let alone a child." A single sentence that traveled further online and did more lasting damage to her than any airline ban ever could have accomplished on its own. I saw that quote weeks later, sitting in my office in Washington, and felt something complicated settle in my chest. I did not gloat over any of it, not once, not even privately. I did not feel triumphant in the exact way movies teach us that justice is supposed to feel when it finally arrives. What I felt, standing at that gate with Eli's small hand held tightly in mine, was something quieter and heavier than triumph could ever be. It was relief, plain and simple. Before we walked further into the terminal toward our connecting car, I crouched down to Eli's eye level right there near the gate, checked his implant one more time carefully to make sure nothing had been damaged, and signed to him slowly, "You were so brave today. I am so proud of you." He signed back, slowly, his small hands still a little unsteady from everything that had happened. I was scared the whole time, and I told him the only truth that mattered in that entire moment. "I know you were scared," I signed. "It is okay to be scared sometimes. But you are safe now, and you will always be safe with me, no matter what happens." He wrapped his arms tightly around my neck, and for the first time all day, I let myself cry quietly, just for a moment, not from sadness anymore but from the sheer release of holding something in for so many hours. It was the only time I cried during that entire trip, and it felt completely earned in a way that few things in my career ever truly have. Later that same evening, waiting for our luggage near baggage claim, Eli suddenly signed something that caught me completely off guard and made me laugh out loud for the first time in what felt like days. A real laugh? Sudden, that night, in our hotel room overlooking a stretch of Los Angeles freeway lit up gold in the dark. Eli fell asleep with his tablet still resting in his hands, having spent nearly 20 minutes before bed drawing a careful picture of an airplane with a big yellow sun beside it, and beneath it, in his careful 7-year-old handwriting, the words "Safe Flight" printed in blocky, determined letters. I sat beside him for a long time after he drifted off to sleep, thinking about how strange it was that a woman who had spent 4 years representing the entire United States in rooms full of prime ministers and presidents had needed, in the end, nothing more than a small leather folio and her own hard-won composure to protect her son on a single ordinary airplane. The title itself never made me powerful in that cabin. My silence did. My patience did. My complete refusal to become the person she wanted me to become, right up until the exact moment it finally mattered, did all of it. I think about that flight often now, more often than I ever expected I would in the months since. I think about how many parents out there don't have a federal badge tucked into their jacket pocket, how many mothers and fathers have sat in a seat exactly like mine, absorbing exactly the kind of cruelty my son absorbed, with absolutely no leverage available to make it stop on their own. That is the part of this story that stays with me the longest, longer even than the satisfaction of watching her walk off that plane in visible shame. Because the truth underneath all of it is simple. Every single child deserves the protection my son received that day, whether or not their mother happens to carry a federal title tucked into her jacket pocket. And no parent should ever need power of any kind to have their child treated with basic human decency by a total stranger. In the weeks after if there is one single thing I hope you take away from this story, it isn't that I won, or that she lost, though both of those things happen to be entirely true. A few months after